excess was barely adequate. I don't know if that was an official slogan of Can-Am, but it's often said about the original Canadian American Challenge Cup, Can-Am for short. The series of races that ran from 1966 to 73, 74. These were ground-shaking cars built to very few rules. They were the fastest road racing cars in the world during their era. And they were driven by some of the best drivers in the world with names like Stewart, Hall, McLaren, Holmes, Gurney, Andretti, Donahue, Fulmer, and still more. Many of these cars live today, and they can be seen in action in all of their glory and hearing all of their sights and sounds at Road America this weekend. Can-Am lives today under the auspices of the Historical Can-Am Association. Dan Davis is chairman of that and publisher of Victory Lane magazine. And he's assembled a panel here tonight to give us some behind-the-scenes insights into Can-Am then and now. And I will pass it on to Dan to introduce the panel and get on with the program.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and see such a great group. And I understand we have a very interesting group, some that are club racers, some that have raced professionally, some are locals that have been out to Road America and maybe saw the original Can-Am. And we'll see if we can add some history to why we think the Can-Am was one of the greatest, most unusual racing series in history, and also why you couldn't duplicate that kind of thing today. It was truly a time when excess was barely adequate, was basically 4 wheels, a couple of doors, you had to have fenders, and just about anything else went. And they tried everything from putting engines in each corner, to big engines, to turbo engines, to 4-wheel drive. It's where they discovered that wings worked upside down on cars. It's where they discovered monocoque construction for big, powerful cars. It was wild and crazy. You went to a race and you never know what you were going to see and what team was going to come up with something interesting. And fortunately, we've got people who were there. Ike Smith was crew for some of the most important teams, saw it grow up, has some great stories. George Drolsom, to my left here, was a privateer, figured out how to go Can-Am racing. He wasn't supported like some were supported by Ford or General Motors, Firestone, Goodyear. I asked George what he spent, and he said, "We didn't figure it, we didn't want to know." We might not could have afforded it. Bob McKee saw professional racing change in this time period from being at Indy, building cars, helping get started in the USRC, building cars for the Can-Am, and so much more that I'll let him tell you about later. And since we're talking Can-Am then and now, we started the historic Can-Am registry in 1987, I believe it was. We held our first historic race at Watkins Glen in 90. We came to Road America, I believe, with about 35 of these historic cars in 92. I was lucky enough to drive one. And so the now is Tom Simpson, who campaigns the McKee and has been a multiple award winner at our historic events. And he can give us some insight on what it's like to run historic Can-Am now. So, Bob, I think we'll put you on the spot and give us some interesting insight into those times.
It definitely was an interesting time, and like Dan said, every day you went to the racetrack, you saw something new and different, and got inspired that, well, we've got to go off in another direction and figure out something smarter. And it was very, very challenging. Nobody had really big money behind them, so you had to be clever and work hard and figure out what kind of car parts you could get, not necessarily from a junkyard, but new car parts or whatever parts you could find to make a car that was competitive at a reasonable price and go off and race.
Well, I think that was another transition time in '66. Would you say the best Can-Am cars had maybe 500 horsepower? 66? And by, it was reputed by '73 that the turbo Porsche in qualifying form could approach 1,500 horsepower. So 9 years and incredible increase in just horsepower. And George, as an independent, trying to make some money and a little bit of glory, had to chase that.
Yeah.
George?
Yeah. It was an amazing thing, driving around a 700 horsepower car and have a guy drive by you like you were standing still. It was really defeating. And I think the Porsche was good for a good 1,000 horsepower in racing condition. It was just incredible.
You saw it up close from having to keep them all together and how it changed over the years. Give us some idea of some of those times.
Is on? In 1966, when the Can-Am started, it was the week after the U.S. Road Racing Championship was over.
You need to get
And you ran what you had. You were running in the USRC, and later on the horsepower gains were outstripping the gearbox technology. And you just kept playing catch up the whole time that you were running. And at that time, nobody except Jim Hall had access to wind tunnel, and you tried aerodynamic things, not really knowing whether it would work or not, and you found what worked and what didn't, and you kept changing, trying to keep up. Gary Knudsen, who was with Team McLaren, they ran Hilborn fuel injection in 1966 on McLaren and Amy's car, and it wasn't successful. And Gary went back to England and went to Lucas and purchased a Mark I Lucas pump and some tubing and the injectors. And they asked him, "What are you going to do with it?" And he said, "I'm going to put it on a Chevy. It'll never work." And the next year, McLaren came back with Lucas fuel injection that, of course, worked. And Gary had designed and machined all the parts for it. And after that, everybody ran Lucas fuel injection. And it changed the way you went about your motor program. But the whole Can-Am was like that. You just kept improving things and doing things.
Were you at that race in '66 at Bridgehampton when Hall showed up with the winged car?
No, but I have pictures that Gil took. And in every picture, there's a driver from another team looking at the car. And he's got probably a dozen pictures, and everybody that was there is in those pictures looking at what he showed up with.
Well, for some of you that maybe hadn't read the books or seen the movies or some of the documentaries, Jim Hall, based on a ranch out in Midland, Texas, kind of hidden away from everybody, supposedly was getting a conduit into General Motors research. And he had been running the United States Road Racing Championship, which was Sports Car Club of America's first professional series. It started in '63. And he had pioneered things like fiberglass chassis and some other items. And he showed up at this race with these upside-down airplane wings mounted on stilts, sticking down onto the rear suspension. And a race car corners fast based on adhesion between the tire and the pavement. And within reason, the more downforce you put on the tire, the tighter it sticks to the course. So he said, let's just put wings on the wheels and stick them to the pavement. And shocked everybody. Bob, you probably saw some of that.
Well, actually, we built an Indianapolis car for Gus Grissom and Gordon Cooper and Jim Rathman. And Grissom said, Bob, you know, you ought to build a car shaped like an airplane wing upside down, and it would really stick to the racetrack and not have much more drag. I said, oh, gee, that really looks silly. I don't think we want to do that. And so I should have done something, but I didn't.
What year was that?
Oh, 64, 65, I guess.
So you might have beat Jim Hall to the punch by a couple of years and been regarded as one of the gentlemen that made racing even crazier than it was.
If I was smarter, maybe.
Tom, even though we're talking about then, you were somehow entranced by wild and crazy cars and great drivers and wonderful tracks like Road America. And by the way, some of the historic Can-Am cars at Road America have been clocked at 242 miles an hour, so they still go fast. Why did you choose to get into vintage Can-Am?
We don't have time for that story. It'd take too long to tell, but basically I was entranced by the cars back then. I just couldn't believe what they were, and in some cases how simple, and in others how complicated. But I thought that was really the top thing, so that when I could afford to finally get into a car of that nature, I did it, and have enjoyed it for the last 27 years, racing the same car, and still love it today, just as much then. As George said, the speed differential, well, it's still there today. Believe me, in one of the oldest Can-Am cars out there, these guys are still going by me real fast. So it hasn't changed.
You do fine. You've won your class at many of our events, I believe, and you drive a McKee that Bob McKee built.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, I do, and I did that. I chose that car. I looked at a lot of different cars. When I was getting ready to do vintage, I looked around. Back in the 60s, I was racing a Corvette. I raced a Corvette into the 70s. I was doing some Simpson, some Trans Am at the time, and that wasn't the way I wanted to go. And there were family constraints and business constraints and other things that got in the way, so I sold everything and rented a few rides along the way. But by 1982, I decided I got to get back into it, and so I started looking around for a car, and I was looking at 906 Porsches. And finally decided that there's just no way I'm going to fit comfortably in a 906. So I was out on the West Coast. I'd been out there for about a month looking at cars, and I started looking at Can-Am cars, and decided that was the right thing for me, was a Can-Am car. And then I came back home and found out, and I'd heard about Bob. I'd heard about his cars back in the 60s when I was racing. Hadn't really paid a lot of attention specifically to them, but the more I learned about them, the more I liked them. He used so many off-the-shelf parts. We have Mustang brakes, rotors and calipers. We have Corvette axles, Corvette radiator, lots of other parts in the car that were easily replaceable. And today you have a Can-Am car that is a period car. It's supposed to be the way it was run in those days. In those days, Can-Am cars changed race to race to race. Well, we just picked a period, built the car, and that's what it is, and that's pretty much the way it's stayed. About the only modern things we have in the car now are the big wide slicks that we didn't have initially back in those days. So the car goes maybe as fast, if on a good day, I can get it to go as fast as it did on treaded tires back in the 60s, but I've got a little more horsepower too, so.
Well, talking about where the historic Can-Am Association is going and where we're going to race these cars, every Can-Am driver, vintage Can-Am driver I've talked to, their favorite circuit is Road America. Head and shoulders above Watkins Glen, Monterey, other great tracks, but Road America is just right for Can-Am. And we did celebrate the 30th anniversary here, we celebrated the 40th anniversary here, and each of those years we had more than 70 of these great cars on track. We're going to do the 50th anniversary here in 2016, so we'll see what we get then. But one of the things we wanted to touch on, it's one thing to talk about big horsepower and wings and monocoque out of composites and all kinds of technical advances, but there were things happening in racing and society that made the Can-Am important. And we were talking earlier, Ike said he started racing in '64 in SCCA. Bob was talking about having to figure out a way to join Sports Car Club of America, which controlled all of road racing in the 50s and 60s. At Chicago region, so SCCA was a small, fairly elite club based in New England. My membership book of 61 had only 1,800 drivers nationwide. And the SCCA weren't sure that they wanted pro racing. They wanted sportsmanlike gentleman racing. And we still kind of do that. But in '63, because of pressure from USAC, SCCA created the United States Road Racing Championship, which Bob built cars for. And they were big V8 powered cars like the one outside that Tom Stefani has brought for us. And that was kind of what got the idea that big, powerful cars were in. And it was quite a shock when these big, powerful cars, professional drivers from all over the world arrived. And Ike, you were kind of watching that happen first as an amateur driver, and then getting into the business. Give us some idea of your view of those times.
As a teenager, I was in a motel room in Vacaville, California, and Chuck Parsons was talking with Ed Leslie and some people about there needed to be professional racing in this country, and that was like heresy at the time. And but eventually it came to that. I helped Chuck on his birdcage Maserati in 1961 as a high school student, and then went on, and you'd go to Seattle and the total purse for over and under 2 liters was $2,500. And all would bring 2 cars from Midland, Texas, and we'd tow up from Monterey and that sort of thing, and the return for whatever you got wasn't close to what was being spent at the time. But it just kept evolving until it was a very viable thing, and the Can-Am, when it came along, paid better than Formula One and any other venue. And the cars were faster than Formula One cars, and it just kept evolving until it was, looking back, it was really something.
George, you went from an amateur driver and into Can-Am, and tell us about your experience.
Well, I was racing in the USRRC in a Porsche 904 in the under 2 liter class, and the fellow I got acquainted with was a sort of a self-made millionaire, and he was really a die-hard mechanic, I would say. And he got to go on races with us once in a while. And we got a chance to buy a Lola T70. So Red and he went ahead and bought the Lola T70, and we ran that in the overclass, the USRC. And about that time, the USRC went away and the Can-Am started. And the Lola T70 would only hold a small block Chevy. And we could see that that was not going to do the job at all. So Red put together a deal to bought a Team McLaren car from Team McLaren. And a friend of ours was a TWA pilot on a 747, and he brought it home as his luggage. There's a picture of the car with a luggage tag on the roll bar. And then we just kept after it. And Red and I went different ways shortly before the end of the Can-Am series.
Well, and one of the things that I think George could share with us wasn't probably half of a Can-Am grid was privateers.
There were only maybe 6 or 8 cars up the front that were the real serious competitors with money and equipment capable of winning. Then there was always guys like me who were pretty consistent competitors, but we couldn't quite finish up in the front. And then there's always some local guys that would just race one Can-Am race a year. So that was kind of the way the field was divided up.
And that was an unusual time. It was not a closed shop. In other words, if you were a local club racer, and in those days, the pro cars were sold to the amateurs and they raced them locally in the club races. So the pro cars were the same as the amateur cars in the 60s. And so if you wanted to race with your heroes, why, you bought a 2 or 3 year old Can-Am car, and when the show came to town, you could, if you were fast enough, you could get on the grid. It wasn't that you had to be a member of a society and post a bond of $1 million, or these days I think Formula One's probably 100 million. But both Indy and Formula One generally are closed shops. You've got to be vetted and post bond and so on and so forth. We talked a little bit about Can-Am, and we've thrown that name around. It actually happened and grew out of the USRC series starting in about 65, and it was a joint production called the Canadian American Challenge Cup Series, and it was a joint sanction by Sports Car Club of America and the Canadian Auto, I believe it's Canadian Auto Club of Canada at the time. And that's why it's Can-Am, and races were in all over North America, Canada, and the US. One of the interesting questions is the challenge in those days of getting parts, working at tracks, right? Nothing too much was off the shelf.
No, you had a McLaren or a Lola, and you made everything. In between races, you took a car from one track to another, worked in Chevy dealerships on a free range basis. You were going 11 months of the year, 7 days a week. In between each race, the car would come down with bare frame or down with a bare monocoque, and everything would be Magnaflux and Zyglode and put back together every 2 weeks. And you'd run, and in order to have before you learn about time, life, and parts and this sort of thing, from what happened to you and what happened to other people, you would just toss U joints every race and change heim joints on certain parts of the car every 2 or 3 races and this sort of thing, and you put in a fresh motor every weekend. When the big blocks came around, at first the liners used to sink in the blocks, and would change the motor every night. And that kind of took the fun out of going. 6 hours to do that, and then you pull the gearbox down and go through the gearbox because they weren't keeping up with the horsepower gains. So it's a lot of work, and you had to be a fan first because we certainly weren't making a lot of money. And but it was, looking back, it was a lot of fun.
For those of you that aren't steeped in the lore of racing, most of the cars ran Chevrolets. There were a few Chevrolet V8s that started with basic small block 360 cubic inches or whatever. Chevrolet introduced the big block in the Corvette, and I think it was a 396 in 67. What year? 65. And then the aluminum block came along in 67 and quickly became the famous 427 and ever bigger aluminum blocks. So when we say big block, we're talking about a 400 to 500 inch aluminum pushrod engine. Ford had forays into it with Andretti driving. Of course, Porsche ended up in the game in 72 and 73 with their 917 turbos and dominated because at that time, all this wonderful innovation that we talked about pretty well got outlawed. The high wings got outlawed after the 69 series. Jim Hall came up with the famous car that sucked air from underneath the car and sucked it to the track. They quickly outlawed that. A lot of stories about politics. But basically by 72 it became a horsepower game. So George, you had to face ever-increasing horsepower. What'd you do about that?
Well, we upped the horsepower as much as we could, but we just had to keep in as best we could. We did end up with an alloy block, and they let us have just one, and we made do with that. So we just did what we could.
My experience, I was lucky enough to buy the team factory Lola run by Surtees in 68. It wasn't very successful, but I made an early morning phone call to John Surtees and bought it. And I think at that time, today, to give you an idea of what it costs to buy a Can-Am car, it was probably 2 years of an engineer's salary to buy the car and enough spares to run, and then about 10 times or 20 times an engineer's salary to go racing with it. I thought I had a sponsor, but my career was electronics, and my sponsor hit a rough spot and backed out, so the car stayed parked. But Bob, you helped a lot of privateers that faced this money problem, and you want to comment on what it costs to buy a car and to go Can-Am racing?
Well, kind of an amusing story. When the USRC was running, we had a couple of cars running in it, and we were in Mid-Ohio. And George Fulmer was driving a little Lotus 23 with a Porsche engine in it. And he was really doing well. He was leading in national points, and they gave the same points for under 2 liter as over 2 liter. And Jim Hall was a few points behind him, and they needed to finish well at Elkhart Lake up here. And Bruce Burness was the mechanic on the car. And I talked to him at Mid-Ohio and said, well, if you want to come to my shop, you can use my shop and make bigger fuel tanks and weld up the frame. They had some things to patch up. So he brought the car back to my shop, and I think they had 2 weeks. And we helped them, and they went through the car. And Fulmer went up to Elkhart here and ended up finishing ahead of Jim Hall and got the national championship. And that was really what got George Fulmer noticed, and from then on, he was doing big, wonderful things. But back then, he was struggling and just barely making it, and towing it with a station wagon, and had 4 of them in the station wagon and the car behind, and going to races.
Yeah, I understand George was an insurance agent and put enough savings in the bank that he could bootstrap a season. And the USRC was a lot cheaper to run, and an under 2-liter car was a whole lot cheaper to run than a big V8. Tom, how is it to run a historic Can-Am in vintage? Is it ransoming the family budget, or are they reliable? How are they?
Well, I find it really reliable. I don't have any problems, or haven't had. You do the engines, you do the transaxle, periodically you go through and do the maintenance on the car that you have to do to keep the car able to be out there and be safe and be competitive. But, back in the 60s, I could put together a Chevrolet engine for $3,000 or $4,000. The last one I bought for my Can-Am car was about $33,000. So, you know, and it's still about the same engine. You know, they haven't changed much, but the technology has gotten so much better, and the parts are so much better, and they're so much more expensive. It's still expensive to run a car. When I was racing in the 60s, I couldn't afford to buy tires all the time. And so I had a deal over here at RR Motors in south of Chicago. They were the Ferrari dealership and the Goodyear dealership, and I would buy takeoff tires from Donahue's Camaro that he would practice on, and I would buy the used tires and I'd run my Corvette. And that was the way of getting by. Now I can afford to buy newer tires, but you know, you still don't buy a set of tires every weekend, or 2 or 3 sets of tires a weekend. You buy a set of tires and make it last for the better part of the season, if you can.
Well, one of the things we like to have is new people getting into vintage racing, and I think Bob mentioned you could buy a competitive, like in 65, 66 USRC Can-Am car without engine for maybe $10,000.
We would build a car, and the owner would furnish the engine, and we would install the engine, plumb it and everything, so when it left the back door, he could take it to a race, and we sold it for $10,500. So times were a lot different back then.
And there's a lot of stories about when Porsche came in, and it was, of course, impossible to assign a value to a car because it was a research project, and some people said the cars were probably costing $1 million plus in '74, and that'd be $10 million today. But as far as getting out there today in a historic Can-Am car, you can buy them for in the $150,000 maybe for a car. And at the same time, you can pay $10 million for one of those collector Porsche 91730s, which I think Jerry Seinfeld bought at auction a few years ago. So a lot of the cars that ran in the day, they were reasonably famous. Some of the Team McLaren cars were pretty good investments for a few people, going for $400,000, $500,000. George, you didn't hang on to any of your McLarens, did you?
No, I didn't. I sure wish I would. But no, they all went away. Excuse me. The Lola went to a club racer, and I finally caught up with at a collector shop south of Jacksonville. It disappeared, and my McLaren was in Steve McQueen's collection for a long time, and now it belongs to us all out in Edmonton, Canada. So they travel around.
Ike, you're working on some interesting cars now. Is there anything unique or special or expensive or cheap or that you can say about the cars?
I just finished a Mark II McLaren that belonged to Jerry Hinton. And Bob Harrison has it here this weekend. And Jerry drove it here in 1967 USRC with Sam Posey, he's a co-driver. And I helped put together an M8 the day after Christmas to haul from Boise, Idaho down to Laguna Beach. And Rick Newt is here with the car this weekend. And the car literally sat in Craig Pence's living room since 1984 in his house. And it's the first time it's run in quite a while. And Rick's driving it this summer. And
Well, there's a lot of discussion about vintage cars being investments as well as a lot of fun and a lot of satisfaction. We'll put a little challenge that we think Can-Am cars are going to be a good investment because with the excitement for the 50th anniversary, anybody out there in the audience that wants to have some excitement and fun, talk to these guys about finding a good Can-Am car and come join in. Should we ask for questions from the audience?
I was going to suggest we do that. Yeah.
Is there a microphone out there?
I'll have to get one and bring it down. I'll be right.
I hope a lot of you do come out to Road America this weekend. The Can-Am cars are on track twice a day, and every session, by the way, counts as qualifying times. We have Friday afternoon races, Saturday afternoon races, but the way we grid them for Sunday is the times they turn all during the weekend. So the Sunday afternoon race is with as much of pomp and circumstance, the national Canadian anthems and the U.S. anthem and the introduction on the grid and the 30-minute race and the trophy ceremony. So we try to do our best to salute the really important race series. We think one of the most important in history. So some questions. We can't see you. So.
Yeah, first of all, this has been absolutely delightful. So thank you all for your enlightenment of what it was like to be back then. Set of race tires. They've gone up quite a bit in the last 3-4 years, and it's harder to get some good years. What tires you're racing? How much does a set of 4 tires cost you? And how many laps do you think you'll get out of it?
Well, I'm using Avon currently, and they're going to cost me for this weekend about $1,700 with tax and mounted. They will last me for, I hope, the balance of the season, so maybe another 6-8 races.
Questions?
George, there's some interesting stories that surround things you did, but I bet people here would like to know what it has got you into Life magazine.
Yeah, that was, we were in Mossport with the Lola, and I was pretty part of the back of the grid, and first lap of the race, everybody was waving like crazy, and I thought, boy, these people really are enthusiastic around here. So you came around the last corner, and there was a big rock, and you went to the left side of the rock to go in the pits, and you went on the right side of the rock to go on down the track. And there was a guy up on top of the rock that sounded a horn when anybody came in the pits. And he was waving like crazy. And I thought, boy, everybody's really excited. And so I got to the starter stand, and he gave me a black flag. And I thought, what the heck is he doing that for? I'm not blocking anybody. And I looked left, nobody there, looked right, nobody there. Looked in the center mirror, and oh my, it was all orange. And you couldn't get off the track for about 3 turns. So I finally got to a flag station where there was a fire extinguisher and got stopped. It was a minor fire, but somehow or another the picture made its way into Life magazine. And guess what happened when my mother saw that? Made my phone ring.
Any other questions?
Another one for you, George. Wondering, what were the professional teams that you were referring to, the 6 or 7 that were always top-notch?
Well, there was 2 McLaren team cars, and there's 2 Chaparrals, and then Carl Haas was running a Lola with Jackie Stewart in it. And most times that was pretty competitive, but they had problems with it. And it actually went backward from the start of the year. It went slower. But there was probably maybe 4 really competitive teams, and the rest of us mostly amateurs and just guys just having fun.
You have shared some of the stories of finding in the most obscure places, but also through some of the historical figures that you have known, some of the pieces for your most recent restoration. Could you share some interesting walk down memory lane of some of the things that are in the Mark II?
On that restoration, we just found different pieces in different places, and the car has a new frame now, new suspension, everything is pretty much new. I got the wheels from Joe St. Pierre in Montreal, and they're ex-Team McLaren wheels from '66, and just the half shafts are out of Mark Donahue's M6, and just hunting down parts and pieces for the car was a challenge to find things. But the body molds I got out of Canada, and it was from the same gentleman. The body molds were for sale. It was the same gentleman that built replacement noses and things for us that we had bought from him in 1966 when the cars were new. And it was just, the hunt is part of the fun of doing a restoration like that. And just about it.
More questions?
Let me make one quick comment on what I experienced back in the day. We had a vintage car owner who was new to the vintage scene, had a couple of big block McLarens, and he was frustrated because he was breaking suspensions at each race. And at our first Watkins Glen race, we had Denny Hume driving on our grid. And we introduced him to Denny and said, Denny, you and Team McLaren had figured out how to keep these things reliable. Because they had so much horsepower, they were just tearing themselves apart. And you used to change a lot of key parts from Saturday to Sunday and share with this vintage gentleman what it takes to really run a proper Can-Am car, at least back in the day. Denny grinned and did dig his toe in the dirt, knew what I was setting him up. And he said, well, generally on Sunday we ran the same body.
Dan, could you address the number of Can-Am cars today versus the cars that came out of the factories back in the 60s. We know that parts found their way, a part here, a part there, became a new car along the way. What's the population look like today?
Well, try as we might, the sport is better off if we're all racing authentic, period correct cars with real history, prepared with real period parts. That's hard, especially with factory cars, because part of the same story. In that era, Can-Am Formula One, the team cars, like Team McLaren, the cars at every race were totally stripped. And I think it's correct. A monocoque might get suspension off of one car or a different car, engines, transmissions. It was whatever was perfect and had been reworked, got put together as a car. So it's pretty tough for the current owners to be for sure that they have the Elkhart winning car or the Monterey winning car. In addition, before we started the Historic Can-Am Association, the Lola coupes, the T70 coupes, were so popular as street cars that one gentleman was building brand new Lola chassis and putting brand new coupe bodies on them. And I'm sure some of those have found their way into being Can-Am Roadsters. We have a new system. We're upgrading our registry. We're trying to get people to just, we accept whatever appears to have history and could have run the Can-Am at our race. We don't try to be the policeman of period authenticity, but we do hope people will be credible and forthcoming on what their car's history really is. And generally the market takes care of it. If you've got a real car, it might go for $200,000 or $300,000 or $500,000, and if it's everybody knows it's a replica, they're generally worth what it costs to build one, $150,000 or so. So does that answer the kind of comment? John, more questions?
I don't, any further questions? One more back here.
This has been very informative. My father owned an M20 back in 1975, and he was Fred New. And prior to that, I had the fortune of driving a McLaren coupe, a road car, and it was one of the most exciting. It's just a statement on the love that I had for Can-Am. They built 3 of those coupes, and my God, I'd come home from college, and there it was sitting in the garage. And my dad had been a formidable racer in the 50s, and we had an opportunity through Al Bartz, who was doing the motors for us, to buy an M20, and it was M20-2. The index of performance or power to weight was so explosive, and the car was so accurate, and it was really a thrill to be part of that opportunity. And we used to run the old Laguna Seca. In the period of 9 years, we were able to come to this lovely track. It was in '79 in conjunction with the Camel GT. And Bob Aiken and I were out there, and my God, it was one of the most inspiring racetracks. It always has been. And my home track's Laguna Seca. But to have a 494 Reynolds, or now most of them are 510s, and to feel them pull on this pit straightaway, it's awe-inspiring. And it's a tribute to McLaren, the man, the machines, Porsche's innovation, and some of the blowovers that this category, and a blowover, watching them fly at Atlanta, watching them fly at various venues, St. Gervais, it was something to behold. And to be here and to be driving a McLaren, I'm not exactly sure what the real difference is between an M8F and an M20, but it was pretty clear at Riverside in '73 when the Crow brothers put the twin turbos on, and the heat factor and the blazing rooster tails of flames coming out down that back straightaway, that if that didn't get your attention in terms of the World Series of just where these cars were just explosive. And it's really an honor to be here, and gosh, I love this track. It's really, really neat place to be. And thank you for the hospitality, man.
Commenting on, for those of you that are not dyed-in-the-wool enthusiasts, most of you probably seen Sam Bosey's insightful comments on motorsports. And of course, he was one of the early Can-Am drivers, and this term blowover was, I guess, experienced at Mount Tremblant first in '66.
Two T-70s blew over at Mount Tremblant, and then later, just you crest the top of the hill and it gets light and it just goes over backwards at 160 plus. And then they had to blow over with Team McLaren at Atlanta and Mossport, the old Mossport, before they cut down the top of the hill, used to get light. Surtees crashed there, Fulmer crashed there, both in T-70s. Laguna Seca turn one, when you crest the hill after start finish, gets very light. It was an exciting time.
So these were the first cars that really, and they were shaped with a curved upper surface, like an airfoil, and a little air underneath them, and like any light plane, they just flew. But they had no controls to land right.
Gentlemen, I just have a question for, I think, all of you. What was it that pulled you toward the Can-Am cars? What truly attracted you to them?
Was the question what truly attracted to our panel members to Can-Am?
Absolutely.
It's just such an exciting series to be involved in. And the cars are so exciting. I don't know. I just have a lot of fun with it.
I think what appealed to me is there were very, very few rules, and the sky was the limit. And whatever you could dream up and put together, you could take it to the racetrack and run it and see if your idea was good or bad.
Well, I was a non-starter in the early Can-Am. As I explained earlier, I was running the Pro Formula Series and was usually in the top three. But my career was in high tech. Lucky enough to be part of the early transistors, early integrated circuits. Liked to be on the cutting edge of technology, and that's where it was. Can-Am was the cutting edge of technology, of automobile and racing know-how. So if you wanted to go where it was at, and that when excess was barely adequate, everything was excess. Aerodynamics, prize money. My wife's here, so I have to be careful about pretty girls. But it was all there. Can-Am was where it was at.
That's about right. It was the foremost series in the world, really. And where else could a farm field in northern Illinois get on the national stage?
It was just kind of an involvement from the USRC, and the series was good, the prize money was good. You, like that before wind tunnels and this sort of thing, you tried different things, tried to make things better. After the event, you sat down and figured out what went wrong or what went right and how you could capitalize on it. And it was everything was can do. You just worked hard to make things better.
Okay, I think those kind words about Road America and the enthusiasm about the Can-Am from everybody be a good time to adjourn for the evening, the program. You're all welcome first to stay and have another cocktail, socialize, and hope to see everybody at Road America this weekend to come and see these exciting thundering cars. Thank you. Danny, you say something?
Great audience, great questions, great food, great ambience, wonderful society to preserve the historic significance of the whole circuit. And thanks again for inviting us.
Thanks.